Yeah, sometimes practices.
Okay, everybody, if I can call time for us. So start with a couple of housekeeping things. Yeah. Oh, I do.
Okay. This is the beginning. First of all, thank you all so much for joining us here tonight. This is the Bradford Island Superfund Site progress meeting. So just making sure you're all here in the room for that reason. I'd like to just say thank you again for taking time out of your schedules to physically be here. Hopefully, as part of the open house, you found some of that information relevant and supportive for the things that you're interested in. So thank you for that. So I would like to start this process by, first of all, welcoming you. And then I'm going to actually introduce Chris Vidai, who is going to provide a few introductory remarks. So real quick, sorry, Chris, that was my warning for you. Let me tell you a little bit about Chris. Chris is the project manager, the technical project manager on behalf of the Corps of Engineers, Portland District. She has a BS degree in geology from the University of Kansas. And I'm with you. We always have to talk about our alma maters, go Jayhawks. And an MS degree from geology from Portland State University. She has been with Corps of Engineers for over 37 years. She works under the CERCLA program, which is the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, because we're trying to minimize our use of acronyms. Her work includes work at the U.S. government moorings located in the Portland Harbor Superfund Site, and of course at Bradford Island. Thank you, Chris.
Okay, thank you, Linda. And I'd like to also welcome everybody and thank you for coming to our second public meeting. And if you recall, our first public meeting was in May, and we told you that we were starting the outreach engagement with the public and that we would start that with interviews. And so we have, through the summer, been collecting interviews with folks, and we are still doing interviews with folks. So if anybody's interested in doing an interview with us, and Linda and her team are conducting the interviews for us, please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you and get your feedback. And I just wanted to say that as a result of those interviews, we saw loud and clear that the public did not know about the fish advisory, or they maybe knew a little bit, but really didn't understand it. And we felt it was really important and urgent to hold another public meeting as soon as possible. And we've invited Oregon Health Authority to come and present on the fish advisory and give that information to the public and answer any questions there, because first and foremost, it's very important to protect the folks that are fishing in the area and make sure they're aware of the advisory and the risks with eating the fish in this area. Secondly, we learned from the public through these interviews that folks really didn't know about Bradford Island or understand what was going on. A lot has been happening over many years at Bradford Island, and many thought, well, we thought you were done. We thought you cleaned it up. And so we thought it was also important to provide information to the public about Bradford Island and what we've been doing and what we plan to do in the future. And the site was recently listed by Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. And so it's a Superfund site now, and we've shifted gears a little bit to work with EPA as the lead regulator, and we are in the process of negotiating a federal facility agreement with them. And so that's an ongoing process, along with all the work that we're doing on the CERCLA cleanup site. And I'm going to use CERCLA because we don't want to use the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act every time. So that's an acronym that I hope people understand what CERCLA means, and we'll use that from here going forward. So I just wanted to kind of lay the groundwork for the purpose of this meeting is to provide that information about the fish advisory, about what's going on at Bradford Island. And thirdly, we want to let you know that the third result from the interviews was there's a lot of public interest in putting together community advisory group. A CAG is what we call it. And so our contractor, Linda, and her team will be providing information about that. And it's just preliminary information. And our intent is to hold another public meeting where we can provide more details about the CAG, but we want to get the word out. And if people are interested in being a member of that CAG, there's an application process, and Linda will go through all that. But we wanted to let the public know that's kind of where we're at with the public outreach, the results of those interviews, and how we're moving the project forward. And so the next slide is
The agenda.
I don't know if I just covered the whole agenda.
Well, and I hopefully it looks better online. That word that is behind Bradford Island is assessment. Real quick. So let's walk through the agenda for you. EPA will, Helen Bottcher with EPA will be our first presenter. She'll be talking about the CERCLA process. Our second presenter will be David Ferrer, right? I like the fact that it's Ferrer. And he will be talking about OHA's program and the fish consumption advisory to date. Then Dan Carlson with the Corps of Engineers will then be presenting on the background and work to date out at Bradford Island. Then I will review with you the community involvement program and our next steps. So talking about the, soliciting interest, always soliciting interest in the community advisory group. And then Chris will then review the next steps, and then we will take questions. So with that, I would like to introduce Helen Bottcher. Helen is Remedial Project Manager with EPA Region 10 office in Seattle. She has more than 25 years of experience in the assessment and cleanup of contamination in aquatic environments. Thank you, Helen. Go right ahead.
I'm going to keep my remarks brief tonight because I think both the Board of Health Authority and the Corps of Engineers have a lot of really important information to share. And I just want to start by introducing my co-project manager, Rich Francis. I know he's available, he's joining us online tonight. And Laura Knudsen is our community involvement coordinator. And you have contact details up here for all of us and business cards on the table in the other room if you want to reach any of us with questions later, feel free.
Helen, I would actually like for you to speak a little more directly towards the owl. We're not getting perfect audio for you.
Okay.
The owls are these cool little things behind you here, everybody. Not to scare you with live animals. Go ahead.
So Chris mentioned a minute ago that the site has been added to the national priorities list. And that happened in April of 2022. And the national priorities list is the nation's list of Superfund sites. These are the worst sites in the nation that deserve EPA's attention and effort to clean up. And so that was a change. And so there are some changes. EPA is going to be providing oversight of the cleanup and the investigation. And as Chris mentioned, we are in the process of negotiating a federal facility agreement right now. That's a specific type of an interagency agreement, and it will lay out a clear process for the cleanup investigation work to happen. It will have schedule, And it will confirm that EPA is the ultimate decision maker if our two agencies don't agree on the cleanup plan. But a lot of things remain the same. And that the listing decision didn't change. And that is most importantly, that the Corps of Engineers is the lead federal agency for the cleanup. So it is Chris and her team that will be actually implementing all of the work. And another thing I want to make clear, adding the site to the nation's Superfund list did not open up a new source of funding. So there's not immediately a lot more funding available. This is still going to be paid for by the Corps of Engineers and Bonneville Power Administration through their regular appropriation process. Next slide. So what have we been doing since the site was listed in April? We've really been focusing at EDK on two things. First is that federal facility negotiation. And that's a very important document for us. It will clearly define the roles and responsibilities of our teams. It will establish a dispute resolution process. So if we ever disagree, there's a clear path to get that disagreement resolved quickly so we can keep the process moving. It has an enforceable schedule and it will be signed not only by EPA and the Corps of Engineers, but by Oregon and Washington. Because the cleanup impacts interests of both states. And so we are working with both states in the negotiation. And our goal is to get that agreement signed within a year. So that would be next spring is our target date for getting that agreement wrapped up. So that's been a big focus of our work since the listing. We've also been spending a lot of time reviewing the existing data that's been developed for the site. And this is a little unusual. Often when we list a new Superfund site, we don't know very much about it. In this case, the Corps of Engineers has been doing investigation work for years. And so we actually have a lot of data. And one of our challenges, it's a plus and a minus. It's a challenge to lay out a process that takes into account all that good work that's been done today and make full use of all the data. So that's part of what we're doing in those FFA negotiations. Next slide, please. So it is a process, and I just want to warn everyone, it is often a very slow process, typically more than 10 years to get to the place where we're ready to announce a cleanup decision. We're hopeful that because of all the work the Corps has done, to date, the process will be shortened, but we still are going to go through a bit of a long process. And we're somewhere in that place where we are working on both the remedial investigation, and that's where we're studying the site, collecting data, doing assessments, figuring out what is the contamination, where is it, in what form, and how is it impacting people and the environment. So that work is ongoing, and at the same time, we're starting to think about where we do know a lot about the contamination, what should we do about it? And that's that feasibility study, that third green arrow. And that's where we look at different remedial technologies that we could use to clean up the contamination. So we're somewhere in between sort of both of those things happening at the same time. The next big step, and this is an important step for the public, is a proposed plan. When we are ready to announce a proposed cleanup decision, that is a point where we, by statute and by regulation, will have to go out to the public and say, this is what we think is the best plan for cleanup, and we take public comment on that proposed plan. So that will happen regardless of anything else. That's a required step in the process. And then once we get the public's input and we have a chance to consider that, we might make some changes to our cleanup decision as a result. We will write a record of decision that selects the final cleanup action, and then we go into remedial design and construction. There is some options for a faster cleanup path if there are source areas, for example, that we think we can remediate sooner. And so that's always an option. And this kind of schedule is one of the things that we're talking about in that federal facility negotiation process. So bottom line It's a process and there's a lot of steps. Go ahead to the next one. I want to talk just a little bit about community involvement. And mostly I want to point out that EPA's role in community involvement at Bradford is to support the Corps of Engineers and to provide oversight. But the Corps, as the lead federal agency for cleanup, is responsible for the community involvement work. And that means developing a community involvement plan and then implementing that plan and ensuring that throughout the process, they are taking time to hear from the community and ensure that community input is impacting the final decision about what to do. So I mentioned earlier that there is one clear point in the process that's that proposed plan. There's one other one that is coming up, and that is the federal facility agreement. That legal agreement is subject to review by the public and public comment. I know the Corps is going to talk about forming a community advisory group, and that is a group that can be formed if there's enough public interest. And I think I'm just going to defer and let the Corps and their team talk about that piece. The next slide. And then the other thing that we do want to talk about tonight is the fish consumption advisory. So there's an advisory in place, and Oregon Health Authority issued the advisory. EPA coordinates with state and local health departments, but those state and local health departments are operating under their own legal authorities. And we feel that the advisory is excellent advice, and we encourage everyone from the public to understand and adhere to the advisory and the good advice that they're hearing from the state. We view the fish advisory as, we hope, a temporary measure. Our goal through the cleanup is to ultimately reduce or eliminate the advisory to get the fish safe enough that it's clean enough that it's safe for people to eat them. But until that can happen, the advisory is an important way of reducing exposure to contamination. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague from Oregon Health Authority, Dave Baer, to walk you through what the advisory currently says.
Thanks, Helen. She said I'm David Baer. For the people who are watching remotely, it feels a little bit weird in the room because everyone in the room has their backs to. So I just want to acknowledge that might feel weird to them also. It does to me as the presenter. Hopefully, if you're watching from home, it doesn't seem weird. Yeah, so I'm David Baer, a toxicologist with the Oregon Health Authority. And I'm going to be talking about the way that the Oregon Health Authority is engaged at Bradford Island and will be moving forward. So next slide. The Oregon Health Authority is a big agency. You might have heard a lot from Oregon Health Authority during the pandemic for COVID-19. The part that is engaging with Bradford Island is called the Environmental Public Health section. And so there's two programs within the Environmental Public Health section that is engaged in here. So one, if you click one time, is the Fish Advisory Program. And the other one is the Environmental Health Assessment Program, or EHAP. So I'll talk a little bit about both of those programs. Next slide. So this is the team. That's me in the middle, David Baer. Todd Hudson's going to be the numbers cruncher, the technical person on one of our projects moving forward. Curtis Koo is the Fish Advisory Program Coordinator. Then we have a health educator, Pradnya Garud, and Kim Pham is our leader, our manager, and Dana Crosby is our program coordinator. Next slide. Both of those programs I mentioned are really dependent on partner agencies. So we rely on environmental sampling data that is collected by EPA and Army Corps and Oregon DEQ and other partners like that to make our decisions and give our advice. We rely on tribal governments to help us get information about how people are exposed to contaminants and also to help us to get the message out. We're funded, this part of our program is funded by a federal agency, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, or ATSDR. So we rely on them for some funding. And then we talk with county health departments, city and regional governments, community-based organizations, and directly with communities to learn how people are getting exposed to contaminants at different sites and to help us distribute information. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with just our fish advisory program. Next slide. So the first thing to know about fish is that it's good for you. It's high in protein, low in fat. It has a lot of vitamins and minerals. Has some something especially good about fish is omega-3 fatty acids that have been shown to increase heart health and help brain development in babies and young kids, and also to prevent some age-related illnesses like neurodegenerative diseases. It's good. So in general, eating fish is good for health. And besides these nutritional benefits, it's like going out and catching fish is also good for you. Like the physical activity of getting out and doing it and being out in nature. And for people who it's part of their traditional culture, it's really there's a lot of psychosocial benefits. It's good for you mentally, connecting with your culture in that way, if that is part of your culture. So fishing is good and eating fish is good. Next slide. The problem is that some fish in some places can have contaminants in them that make them more risky to eat. So in Oregon, almost all of our fish advisories are caused either by mercury or by polychlorinated biphenyls or PCBs. So almost all of our advisories, and the ones that we'll talk about tonight, are caused by either one or a combination of these chemicals. The problem with them is that they both also they impair brain development in babies and young kids. So just like the omega-3s in fish promote that development, these contaminants actually are bad for that development. So you go to the next slide. See that part of what we're trying to do in the fish advisory program is balancing the health risks from those contaminants against the health benefits of eating fish. So that's what this program is kind of all about. Next slide. This is not intended for you to read everything on this slide. The main thing from this slide to take away is the URL at the bottom. This is a screenshot of what you'll see. Some of those columns are messed up. They're not on the website. So if you go to the website, it'll look like a normal table. You can see the list of all of our fish advisories in Oregon in one place, and have some understanding of what the limits are, what water bodies are affected, and what the contaminants of concern are. Next slide. So in each of our advisories, the key information that we want people to understand is the geographic boundary of the advisory area, like what is the water body that's under advisory, and what species of fish are included. Different species of fish accumulate contaminants differently. So two species might have a different advice from the same water body. And also, and finally, the actual meal limit. So how many meals a month is the advice for those fish in that place. So I'm going to walk through a couple of specific advisories that are around or in the Bradford Island area. So next slide, please. So Bradford Island is the advisory that is most applicable to the Superfund site. It actually encompasses the Superfund site, I think. So it runs from Bonneville down upstream about 1 mile. And it ends where the Multnomah County and Hood River County line is. It's also where Ruckle Creek enters the Columbia on the Oregon side. It's about 1 mile up from the dam. So that's the area covered. Next slide, please. And so this part shows you the species affected and what the advice is. So for that longer list with the red, that is an actual do not eat advisory. So we recommend that none of these species of fish should be eaten at all within that are caught from that area. Those fish are all what we call resident fish, meaning they're ones that don't migrate in and out, and that's why they have more contaminants, because they kind of live their whole lives in this contaminated area, accumulating contaminants. On the right, you can see that salmon, steelhead, and American shad are not included in the advisory. That's because they're migratory and are just passing through and have less contaminants in them. Okay, we'll talk more about lamprey in a minute. Next slide. Oh, yeah, I'll get to the lamprey. So next slide.
Okay.
So this is another advisory that's adjacent to the Bradford Island Advisory. So you can see where that red spot to the left is the area covered by the Bradford Island Advisory. Where that one leaves off, there's another advisory that runs all the way from there up to McNary Dam. So that's about 150 miles of the Columbia River. We call that the Middle Columbia River Advisory. It's a large area. Next slide. And here's the list of fish that are affected by that advisory. Again, the resident fish are in the yellow there for the most part. And the advice is 1 meal per week or 4 meals per month, however you want to work it out for yourself. But it's about this, we mean it the same way, 1 meal a week or 4 meals per month. There's a do not eat on the northern pike minnow, and that's because Washington has a statewide do not eat advisory on pike minnow. And then again, the migratory fish are not included because they're much cleaner. They're just passing through. Next slide. Yeah, and lamprey, we'll get there right now. So the lamprey advisory, it's a big area that's affected. So this applies to all of the Columbia River and all of the tributaries to the river in Oregon. So all those rivers down in Oregon are tributaries to the Columbia River. And these are all places where you could theoretically find a lamprey. So it's a large area that this advisory applies to. Next slide. So the advice differs depending on who you are. So if you are a young child under 6 years old, if you're a person who is or may become pregnant, if you're nursing, if you're someone with a thyroid or immune system problem, then the recommendation is 2 meals per month. If you're anyone else, the recommendation is 4 meals a month. That's for the specific lamprey and all of that area, the Columbia River, including its tributaries in the Oregon side. Next slide. And so this is the last advisory I'll talk about. This is the sturgeon advisory that applies to the lower Columbia River. So in the map there, the letter B in the orange square, that's the Bonneville Dam. So that's adjacent to the Bradford Island Advisory on the other side of the dam, running all the way downstream to the mouth of the Columbia. So that's the area covered. The species is sturgeon. And for this group, for this fish, I mean, the meal advice is 4 meals a month for those vulnerable groups that I mentioned on the last slide, and 6 meals a month for everyone else, kind of general population. Well, okay, I'll say this part later. Next slide. So when we talk about meal sizes, I just want to make sure it's clear what we mean by that. So we're talking about an 8-ounce meal. It's about the size and thickness of your hand. We like to use the hand as that marker of size because it scales with the size of the person. So, a child will have a smaller meal. It'll be about the size and thickness of the child's hand, if it's the child eating the meal. And lamprey, we have this picture here. The Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission has got this picture for us. This is a traditional way to prepare lamprey to eat. And each of these segments is roughly 8 ounces. We use this picture instead of the hand because it's not shaped like, the eel doesn't come in the shape of a hand. So that's about, each of these segments is about an 8-ounce meal. Next slide. That came through a little weird on mine, but we like to show people a graphic like this because there are ways you can prepare fish that will reduce the amount of PCBs that you'll get. So if you cut off the fatty parts of the fish, skin it, it can reduce the amount of PCBs in the fish. That doesn't work for mercury because it's in the fillet of the fish. So you can't really reduce the mercury in the same way. So I'm about to move off of the fish advisory part of the presentation. And before I do that, I just wanted to reiterate what Helen said, that our goal is not to have fish advisories. What we would prefer is clean fish. So we share the goals that the tribes and the Army Corps and EPA have, that rather than having advisory, we would just have clean fish, so we don't need advisories. I think that's really important. We view these all as kind of a stopgap measure until the fish are clean enough to eat. But while the contamination is here, this is our best advice for how to reduce risk from the contaminants. Okay, next slide. So that's how our fish advisory program is engaged at Bradford Island. The other program is EHAP, the Environmental Health Assessment Program. Now that the site has been listed as Superfund, through our partnership with ATSDR, our federal funding agency, we're going to be working to create a public health assessment for Bradford Island. In this process, we work with tribal communities, general community, and partner agencies to try to keep community health risks at the center. So it's all about trying to answer that question about whether or not contaminants at the site could make people sick, and to generate recommendations to partner agencies and to communities about how to reduce that risk. In this health assessment, we're going to try to include not only chemical stressors, but also non-chemical stressors. So, some examples of that would be like loss of a resource. Like we're recommending against eating fish in the short term, but that comes with its own risks. As we've talked about, like it's good to eat fish, and so loss of this healthy food resource is also a health impact. So we're going to try to talk about that in our public process. Next slide. So this is basically the way that it works. So a health assessment is trying to answer the question, will my health be harmed by this chemical exposure? The inputs to that are environmental sampling data that come from partner agencies like EPA and DEQ, Army Corps, and it also comes from communities, because community knows better than anyone else, like how they come into contact with contaminants. They know more than anyone how many fish they eat, or how they interact with soils on the island. So we are going to be wanting to talk to communities to gather information that will be inputs to our public health assessment. We take all that information together in this evaluation phase, where we're trying to answer questions like, what are the contaminant levels? How do people come into contact with it? Could the exposure lead to illness? And are there any relevant health data that we can look at? And then finally, the outcome of that process is a conclusion, a determination. Like, is this exposure a problem? And if so, what needs to be done about it? And that will come out in the form of recommendations. Okay, next slide. So I wanted to show the difference between the fish advisory program and the health assessment program. And I would say that in this way, the health assessment program is kind of similar to the risk assessment that Army Corps will be doing under EPA's oversight. They're answering different questions. So the fish advisory is trying to answer the question, how much fish can I safely eat today based on what's in them? The public health assessment and EPA's risk assessment will answer the question, well, what would my health risk be if I ate as much fish as I should be able to eat? If I ate as much as I wanted to eat, what would my risk be? And then it also is looking at a broader set of data. So if you click one time, the fish advisory program is really just looking at data from fish and shellfish, because that's all we really need to answer that question about how much you can safely eat. If you click again, our other program, EHAP, is looking at a broader set of data. So we're also looking at water data, soil on the island, in addition to what's in the fish and shellfish. And then if you click again, that's really what we're trying to do with the fish advisory. We're advising people today what is the healthy amount of fish to eat. And then on the one more click on the EHAP side, where it's about developing recommendations to responsible parties, agency partners, and communities about steps they can take, they could be taken, that they can take to reduce risk overall. So that's it for my slides. I can take questions here if there's any gathered up or.
Yeah, we'd like to pause here as part of the presentation and just ask if there's any questions, because particularly the lamprey advisory is relatively new. If anybody had any questions.
I know the data for the lamprey is a little bit older, and I think there was something that changed that allowed for it to finally be released to advisory in 2022. I can't remember what it was. Can you remind me what that change was?
Yeah, that's right. So the data that we're using for the lamprey advisory is pretty old. And the main thing that changed was our methodology and how we calculate risk for fish advisories. For a long time, we have been looking at one contaminant at a time to do risk, and then going with whichever chemical resulted in the most restrictive advisory. But more recently, we started looking at the combined risk from mercury and PCBs. So when you look at those two together, it highlighted that once we made that change in our process, we went back to our older data to look at it again and see if it would change how we approach it. And in this case, it's definitely doing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Very helpful. David, as part of the open house, were there other questions that were brought up to you at that time that maybe you wanted to share an answer on?
No, I actually did not get questions during the open house.
Okay. Jeff?
So one thing is, it's very clear the boundaries of the Middle Columbia River Fish Consumption Advisory. And for people that are fishing in the Bonneville Dam area, I was just curious, so the only fish advisory that's immediately downstream of the dam right now is for the lamprey, is that correct? Or there is another fish advisory that addresses the area from Bonneville Dam? Yeah,
So the lamprey advisory, encompasses all, like both Bradford Island and the whole river. The sturgeon, the lower Columbia sturgeon advisory goes from Bonneville Dam downstream up to the mouth. So that it doesn't overlap, but it's adjacent to it going downstream.
Okay.
And the other questions that we have that we've received online so far and from the room are not related to fish advisory. So we're going to hold them until that. Okay.
Thank you, Katie. Dan Carlson, Corps of Engineers.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. And so on this slide, we had some introductions for some of the Corps of Engineers members that are working on the project. And I think we'll just go through and do some introductions for each of us. Chris, I know you already did your introduction. So I'll go next and just introduce myself as Dan Carlson. I'm an environmental scientist with the Army Corps of Engineers. I've been working with the Corps for 3 years, and during that time, I've also been working on the Bradford Island project. I'm currently acting as a technical lead where I support the investigative and remedial work across the project. And prior to working at the Corps, I was in environmental consulting for 10 years, cleaning up other contaminated sites. And I'll pass it to John Morgan, our public affairs specialist.
Good evening, and thank you for being here. My name is John Morgan, and I'm a public affairs specialist. I've been working with the Corps for about 3 years now. Some of my duties and responsibilities are to maintain the public website, also to issue press releases, media releases, public announcements, public notices, and I also am in charge of our social media tweet. Twitter site, tweets. Anyway, and so I like that to Christy Burns.
Hi, I'm Kristen Kurtz. I have a background in toxicology and human health risk assessment. I provide technical support to the Bradford Island project, and I've
I've been with the Corps of Engineers in the Seattle District Office for about 15 years.
And I'm Bill Gardner. I'm a risk assessor with the Seattle Army Corps of Engineers Office. I have a background in risk assessment and toxicology and sediment expertise. I've been working with the Corps for 5 years, and I was in consulting for about 25 years before.
Great. Yes, good evening. My name is Craig Johnson. I'm the tribal liaison for the Army Corps of Engineers out of Portland. I've been working with the Corps for about 5 years now. Just to talk about tribal interaction, we have a completely different process with government to government consultation with the tribes. However, we do welcome tribal interest in individuals that would like to comment during this period. So with that said, thank you, and I'll hand it back over to Daniel.
And Dan, if you'll speak up.
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Go to the next slide. And so I'll be covering some background and history for the sites. And many of you on the call are probably familiar with the site already. And if you're on our last public meeting, you'll have seen much of this information. But as Chris mentioned earlier, some of the feedback that we did receive from recent community interviews was that there are a lot of folks that weren't familiar with the site. So we felt it important for other people that are now called in to kind of get this background on our site history. Go to the next slide. And so just starting with where the site is located here at the Bonneville Dam Complex, the Bradford Island site. And this is located about 40 miles east of Portland and just about 3 miles west of where we're located right now, Cascade Locks. And so Bradford Island is that middle island there. The site of Bradford Island is on the eastern portion of the site, just east of the spillway. And so the major components of the Bonneville Dam are that spillway in the center there that is opened at various times of the year to control water flow from excess water to be released further downstream. And then there's the two powerhouses you can see on the figure there, powerhouse 1 and 2, and that's where the water flows through to generate power for the dam. There's also a navigation lock on the southern end between Robbins Island and the Oregon shore where ships can navigate through. And so that's the basic structure of the Bonneville Dam. And we'll go into some more detail about the Bradford Island site. We'll advance to the next slide. And so just starting with some site history. And so really that started with the Bonneville Dam being constructed in the 1930s. And that construction was completed in 1938. And so really what's happened since the Bonneville Dam was constructed, there's been ongoing operations. There was a small residential community with 20 homes that were built near the dam. And over time, some waste from that residential community and from ongoing operations at the dam had been buried at a landfill that was located on the northeastern portion of Bradford Island. And there's also been other industrial activities taking place at that eastern end of Bradford Island that has resulted in some contamination. You can see on the slides here, it just kind of goes into detail as to when some of those operations were active, during what years, and during what years they ceased being active. And the other thing of note is in the 1950s, there was disposal of electrical equipment off the north shore of Bradford Island into the Columbia River at some point during that time, resulting in contamination of the river. And so we can go to the next slide. And so progressing along in the 1980s, that's when the landfill closed. Some of these other activities remained in use, like the sandblast area. But it was really in the 1990s that environmental investigations began at Bradford Island following some recent environmental regulations that had been going on. And so it was in 1997 that investigations at the landfill began. We knew that there was a landfill that had been active there. So they wanted to assess the contamination, the extent of it. And during that time, they investigated the other operations and possible sources of contamination that might be at the island for these other areas of interest that were identified, like the sandblast area she'll talk about on another slide, and the pistol range, and the bulb slope. And so they found contamination in these different areas. And that all got rolled into completing a remedial investigation, which Helen had talked about as part of the CERCLA process on an earlier slide, where they really summarized all the contaminants that were found, what media, environmental media they were found in, and risk assessments were completed shortly thereafter as well, using that data to understand who is at risk from these contaminants and at what levels might warrant further consideration for cleanup. And in the 2000s, shortly after the investigation started, and we were realizing we had this contamination on the island, we're seeing this landfill, some equipment and debris looks like it's gone over the side of the island. So they discovered the electrical equipment at that time in the year 2000 that had been disposed of off the side of the islands and into the river. And that equipment was removed shortly after, which I'll discuss on a further slide. But to just finish with the site history here, kind of advancing from the remedial investigation and the risk assessment, there's been additional investigations of additional media at the site, or soil and sediment sampling, more tissue in the river for fish and crayfish to further understand the extent of contamination. We realized there were these data gaps that had to be filled in order to best select the most comprehensive cleanup remedy for the site. And we can go to the next slide. And so this slide really shows the two, what we call operable units associated with the site. And that's a term used in CERCLA as part of the Superfund process. And it's really just dividing the site right now into these two operable units that are assessed for their own cleanup remedy. And so the first one you can see on the figure in gold is that eastern portion of Bradford Island, just east of the spillway. And that's where those activities took place, mentioned on the last slide, with landfill, the sandblast area, the pistol range. So that's the area of the uplands contamination. And then the river OU there is this whole forebay behind the Bonneville Dam, and all the way up past Goose Island, which is a small island. It's kind of hard to see there on the figure. But as David was showing earlier, the fish advisory, it's very similar, that OU boundary to where the fish advisory extends up to. And that was selected based on where known contamination was off the north shore of Bradford Island, as well as where contamination may be extended to based on modeling of currents and things like that. And we can go to the next slide. And on this slide, this shows the upland operable units in more detail in those four areas that I mentioned, which we call the areas of potential concern, or AOPCs. And so to just briefly talk about them more, there's the landfill there on the northeastern end of the island, where waste had been disposed of for decades. And it's not what would be a typical landfill that has a very structured approach to one large pit where waste is buried. This was really a series of pits over years that different materials had been buried over in that landfill area. The pistol range in purple on the south end of the island there, and that's where small arms practice took place for a couple of decades, and some resulting contamination from that activity. And then there was the sandblast area in red, that larger area on the north end. And it's called that because that's where sandblasting activities took place. There was a building there at the time where they would sandblast operational metals and materials to take strip paint off these materials, and sandblast grit that resulted from that process escaped that building and contaminated soils in the area. And there were some other activities, industrial activities in that area as well, and a couple above ground storage tanks. And then the last area to mention is just the bulb slope on the north end there. It's a little hard to see in the figure. It's the smallest AOPC. on the north end of the island, and that's where it was discovered electrical debris and light bulbs had been disposed of, resulting in superficial soil contamination off the slope there. And on another slide, I'll talk a little bit more just about what contaminants were found in these areas and what are present. But just to highlight those areas now on this slide. And I think we can go to the next slide. And so just to summarize that remedial investigation a little bit from the contaminants that were found in the uplands and the river. And on the slide here, we list those different contaminants types. In the uplands being metals and organic contaminants like PCBs and pesticides. And then in the river, the contaminations primarily from PCBs is the contaminant of concern there. Also some detections of pesticides as well in that area. And so those contaminants were detected in these different organisms for clams and crayfish and fish, as well as the sediments just off of the North Shore. And for the uplands, those contaminants listed are present throughout many of the AOPCs, but the magnitude at which they're detected differs between the areas, and some areas don't have those contaminants. So for the Pistol Range, really the contaminant of concern in that area is from metals. As a result of those operations, the landfill has a much wider range of contaminants within it, including all those listed above. And the sandblast area, mostly metals are the concern from the sandblast grit in that area. There's also some volatile organic compounds and PAHs or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. So these different chemicals vary by area, and that's all defined within the remedial investigation. And really the risk assessments also mentioned that happened briefly after that, just summarize or go into detail as to how these contaminants will be affecting people and what the risks are, and that's informing the cleanup decision from there. I think we can go to the next slide. And just wanted to mention the cleanups to date. So while we're going through this kind of long CERCLA process and figuring out comprehensive remedies for the uplands and the river, there were some actions that were taken early on as soon as some of these contaminants were discovered in the river. And so after these electrical equipment that contained the PCBs was discovered in the river off the North Shore of Bradford Island in 2000, a little bit was removed at that time, but the majority of that was removed in 2002. And this image is showing some of that activity here, where they removed all that material from the river, and they did dive surveys prior to and after the survey to ensure, prior to and after the cleanup, to ensure that all of the equipment, that primary source of contamination had been removed. And that was 32 tons of debris in total that was removed as part of that. And we can go to the next slide. And so the other action that took place was in 2007. And this was following additional sampling in the river and these higher areas of sediment contamination that are highlighted in removal areas 1 through 3 here on the figure. Those were all targeted, and using diver-assisted hydraulic dredging, they removed 60 tons of the more contaminated material from those areas for that contaminated sediment. So just to highlight that there were these actions that took place, but further sampling since then has realized that there is still this problem and contamination in the river, where there's more secondary sources of contamination from the PCBs that have gone into the river bottom. So that's why we're doing this further work for sampling in the river and figuring out this comprehensive cleanup option. And I think that's it for my summary here on the site background. And I will pass it off to Linda and your team to discuss the community involvement.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan. My portion of the presentation is going to talk about the Corps of Engineers Community Involvement Program. My name is Linda Balcom. I'm with Balcom Environmental Services, and I'm here with my team partner, Longnecker and Associates, Katie Roberts is here with me. So thank you. I appreciate this opportunity to talk about the Corps' community involvement program. So there are multiple ways that the Corps of Engineers is looking for the community to engage with them throughout this process. At this time, we're obviously have been in the midst of the interview portion of the community involvement. The interview portion, of course, will inform the comprehensive community involvement plan. In the interim, what the Corps has been providing are updates to their current websites, as well as their social media channels. This is our second public meeting to review the program and particularly very specific information that the community has requested as a part of this interview process. And there has been strong support expressed through all of those that we have interviewed so far in supporting a community advisory group. So let's talk about what a CAG is. So a CAG, sorry, that was my bad Southern accent, talking about a community advisory group. It is composed of the community. It's important that this community advisory group represent the very diverse interests of the community. It will be the focal point of your interaction, the community's interaction with the Corps of Engineers and EPA throughout this process. And it provides a forum for all interested members to participate in this process. This is an advisory group. So what you do is you elevate issues from the community to make these two large federal entities, the Corps of Engineers and the Environmental Protection Agency, aware and familiar with your concerns as a community member. So the role of the CAG. So you're going to get information from these agencies about the site. And at the same time, you're going to provide, it's a two-way street. You're going to then provide information to these agencies about your concerns. You're going to talk about, perspectives. You're going to talk about proposed outcomes and desired outcomes. And you're going to provide input to these agencies responsible throughout this process. And really, this is a collaborative relationship among the CAG, EPA, the regulatory agencies, and the Corps of Engineers. That is the goal of all community advisory groups. So how often the CAG will meet will actually be determined by the participants in this community advisory group. You will set the agenda and you will set the schedule. So where are we now? So you have heard that there is extreme interest in this. We have identified that interest through conducting the interviews. The next step on this will be for the Corps of Engineers to convene a selection panel. This is not the Corps of Engineers picking. This is community representatives who will actually meet with the Corps of Engineers to provide their advice on who represents the diverse interests of the community. Once that panel is convened, we will then, of course, happy to take all interested parties. I have some already, but anybody who's interested, if you're here in the room, sign up with me. I would love your participation as part of the CAG. If you were watching us virtually, you can send it an email to, hang on, I've got the email address handy. It'll be at the end of the presentation, but obviously we would love to hear from you about your interest in participating in the CAG. So here is the Bradford Island public comment inbox. Hopefully that makes logistic sense to remember. You can always go to the Corps of Engineers Bradford Island site to actually get to this inbox. So that should help. And right now the Corps is in the process of developing their guidelines as well as the application process, as well as, so again, we are still at the early stages of this, but we're excited because there seems to be very strong community interest in setting up this community advisory group. We are hoping to schedule another meeting in the near future to actually walk through the specifics of what it means to participate as part of a community advisory group. So an opportunity to both learn more about the process, learn more about the roles and responsibilities, and learn more about what it means to participate in this process. So with that, I would like to hand this back to Chris to review the next steps.
Okay, thank you, Linda. So our next steps are primarily involved with the community involvement, the federal facility agreement, and what technical work we can do while that federal facility agreement is being negotiated, which is limited. So first, with the community involvement, as Linda mentioned, we are at a point where we've done the interviews. Our contractor, Linda, and her team have provided us a draft community involvement plan. So we're trying to get that community involvement plan finalized, and then we can provide that to the public for any feedback they'd like to give us. But that will be our plan for the community involvement. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of this meeting, we'd like to have the next public meeting be more of a workshop where we can provide the information on what a CAG is going to do and how participation is going to happen. We are in the process of putting together that framework for the CAG, and that's like a starting point. It's just kind of the guidelines that will be provided to those that are selected to be members of the CAG. And then they will form their own charter, like Linda said, and they'll determine when they want to meet, how often, where, and so forth. And they will elect a chairperson to represent them. And the Corps will have a chairperson. So there's co-chairs for the CAG meeting, and the co-chairs will work together to set the agenda and get the information out to the community, because it's not just CAG members that attend these meetings. These are open to the public. Everything we do needs to be open and transparent to the public. And so that's why we're standing up these CAG meetings, and we need members of the community to help run these meetings and set the agenda. And then the Corps will definitely participate and go to the CAG and present the latest information we have on our technical investigations and so forth, and solicit feedback from the public and get your issues and concerns known, so we can take those under consideration as we move forward. So along with CAG meetings, we would also be still having general public meetings to provide the general public with updates and keep everybody informed what's going on in the project. So that's the community involvement piece. The federal facility agreement, Helen covered that pretty well, and we are working very closely with EPA to negotiate that federal facility agreement. And the technical work, we had collected quite a few bits of data trying to fill data gaps. And so our team is working on preparing data reports, basically compiling all the information, validating the data, and putting those data reports together. We have to wait until we have a signed federal facility agreement at this point in the process before we can move forward with developing any remedial alternatives, unless we're able to work out an agreement with EPA that allows us to move forward on that work and have credit for doing that work and not have to go back and redo it after the FFA is signed. So we're still working with EPA to work out the terms and conditions for that, so we can keep work moving forward as we work through the negotiation of the FFA. And the Helen covered the CERCLA process and very accurately described that we are basically at that juncture of trying to wrap up the RI. We have draft feasibility studies, so we're somewhere between a remedial investigation and a feasibility study. And we'd like to keep moving that forward for both the upland and the river. They each have their own feasibility study, obviously, because they have different remedial alternatives to look at. They're very different environments. And so once we have those put together, they will be presented to the public for comment, and we'll do that through the CAG. Again, that's why it's very important to get the CAG up and running. So when we have these products we produce, we can get them out there in the public domain and have discussions about them, because these CAG meetings will have technical discussions and we can answer questions real time and listen to concerns or opinions and take those under consideration as we move forward with trying to finalize those documents. Once we do have a final feasibility study, the next step would be writing up the recommended alternative in what's called a proposed plan. And there would be a proposed plan for the upland and one for the river. And we're farther ahead in the upland, so that would probably come first. And as Helen said, that proposed plan by statute is required to go out for public comment. I think a minimum 30-day public comment period for the proposed plan. And then once that comment period is over and we've addressed comments, that then is all of that information is written up as a record of decision, a ROD. And that has to be agreed to by both the lead agency, which is the Corps, and EPA. That's where EPA has their decision authority, is on the recommended alternative for remediation. And then it is signed by both agencies, and that concludes what we call the RIFS phase, the remedial investigation feasibility study phase, and allows us then to move into the remedial design phase, because you know what you're going to do for remediation. Then it's just a matter of working out the design and implementing that, doing the remedial action and doing the actual cleanup. So it's a very linear, rigorous process, the CERCLA process, but that's kind of what the future looks like here.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you, everyone. That is the end of our formal presentation. So we would like to open up the virtual forum and the room for questions. If you've got questions, it's very helpful if you write them out so that we can actually have Katie distribute them to people. And of course, we're actually trying to collate all of the online questions. So I'm going to hand it to Katie, who's going to tell us what.
Beautiful.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists. Guys did a fabulous job. Thank you. Got some great questions. I'm going to start with an online question first. And this is from Bob Salinger. And his question is, will there be a criminal investigation attached to this cleanup process? This contamination was caused by a federal agency, and it took a very long time to daylight this situation. Is the EPA looking into how this happened and why it remained hidden for so long? So I think this question is directed to EPA. So Helen, please.
Sure, thank you for the question. And the answer is no, there is not any plan to conduct a criminal investigation. And in part, that's because the Superfund law, or the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, or CERCLA, that we've been talking about, is not a criminal statute. The law has an unusual and very powerful liability stream. The liability is strict, it's joint, it's several, and it's retroactive. And collectively, what those things mean is that companies or federal agencies that whose activities result in contamination can be compelled to clean that up. And it doesn't matter if they broke any laws. They could have abided by every environmental law in place at the time. And if there's a problem today, Superfund says they have to fix it. If their neighbor and they both contributed to the problem, the joint portion of that liability says they both have to pay. And if the retroactive part means that if the contamination occurred years ago, in the 20s, in the 30s, in the 40s, before we had environmental laws, and it's a problem today, Superfund says you have to fix it. The law is very focused on fixing the problem. It does not care if you violated any law. It doesn't care who did it. The law just compels the agency to clean up the waste so that it is no longer a risk. So it's a very forward-thinking law. And that is the law that we're going to do this cleanup under, and it does not contain any criminal provisions.
Thank you. So the next question, this is for the Corps, so you guys can figure out who's gonna answer, but how much money will the Corps need in the regular appropriations process to address this?
I suppose I'm the money person. That's a very difficult question. That's to be determined. We don't know. We've spent a lot already and we know we're going to be spending more. We have to follow the CERCLA process and each step will be funded as we go through it. We don't have a total project cost estimate at this point because it depends on what the remedy is going to be. And you have to get to the point where you're actually kind of in that proposed plan phase where you know what the recommended remedy is and you can kind of do the cost estimate on that, and then you have a better idea what that would cost. So, but at this point in time in the CERCLA process, we don't have a good handle on what the total project cost would be.
Okay, next question. This is also for the Corps. What data reports and investigations are the Corps currently working on?
At this time, there's been additional data that was collected leading up to the NPL listing. And we're in the process of just kind of summarizing and finalizing some of those data sets. But we're not working on the interpretation side of that data much at this point in time until the federal facility agreement is completed and we have a more straightforward path agreed upon with the other FFA parties on how to move forward. And we kind of have agreement on all the work that's been done to this point and have laid out that roadmap on how to proceed with additional investigations as needed and further interpreting that data. And I don't know if anyone else wants to add.
Yeah. So I guess to be specific, some of the current work that is undergoing is we did some groundwater sampling in 2022. So that data report is in progress. We have fish tissue data as well as clam and crayfish data from 2020, as well as some 2022 collection efforts that occurred for bass. And then soil sampling that occurred in the sandblast portion, which is also, a data report that is already publicly available. So those are the most kind of current specific activities we've been doing in recent time.
Okay, next question. What efforts are being made to communicate fishing advisories to folks fishing in the area? Are there signs up?
So I'll take that. This is David Farrer, Oregon Health Authority. The fish advisory program is not actually funded. So we were leveraging other funds for staff time on the program. So there is no budget for like ongoing like signage or community outreach work. So we hope to. So what happens generally is that when an advisory is new, we issue a news release to notify people about it. We have the information on our webpage, and that's pretty much the extent of what we're able to do, unless we have a partner who's willing and able to work with us to distribute information. And one of the things that we have been thinking about a lot in the last couple of weeks has been, well, longer than that, but how to, like, which partners to reach out to and how to get the word out better about the existing advisories. Because what does tend to happen is that there's a lot of news about it when it first is issued. But this advisory was from 2013, so it's been a long time since there's been a concerted effort to raise awareness of it. So we are looking for partners and are interested in working with any group that will work with us to help us raise awareness and get the word out about that advice.
So I could add to that, David, that when we learned that, because we assumed that you, the Oregon Health Authority, would be getting the word out. When we found out that you really don't have the budget for that and you don't have a means to do it, the Corps took it upon themselves to go ahead and take the information on the fish advisory, and we printed those up on signs, and we have posted those signs at locations all along federal land that we have control over. And we sought permission to post those signs at, say, boat launches in the area and access points for fishing. So the Corps have posted the signage and tried to get the word out that way on both sides of the river, Oregon and Washington. And what we found through the interviews was that some folks that were fishing said, yeah, we saw the signs, but nobody came and talked to us and told us about it, so we don't really know what it means. And so even though we posted signs, we realized we need to do more. And again, that's why we're having this meeting, is to get the word out and to get the information to the public about the fish advisory and the risks there. And I would ask everybody in the room and who is signed on, if you can, tell your neighbor, let them know about the fish advisory and the risks associated, because we really want to get the word out. And it seems to work best to pass it person by person, especially person to fisher person, because they're the ones using the river and the resources. And if we can get enough of those folks educated on what the fish advisory is about and to spread the word about what fish are safe to eat and what aren't, then we're all doing better, I think, as a community. So that's what we've done to help you as a partner in getting the word out, David.
Okay, next question. This comes from Bob Salinger as well, online. And his question to EPA is, this situation was daylighted on the front of the Oregonian more than 20 years ago. Why did it take more than 20 years for EPA to list it on the MPL?
That's a good question. So I'll say that it is somewhat unusual for EPA to list federal facilities on the Superfund list. A lot of federal agency partners have the means and wherewithal to act as the lead agency and to conduct cleanups without EPA's involvement. And so it's been quite a while. I think 2013 was the last time we added a federal facility to the national priorities list. The Corps has been doing, as you heard tonight, conducting investigations and doing cleanup work for a number of years. And they were doing that work in partnership with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. And so Oregon was overseeing the work. And they got quite a bit of cleanup work done. And we've learned a lot through the investigations. But obviously there's more work to be done because the fish are still so contaminated that we have this advisory in place. And I think really what changed and brought EPA to the table was the public. We received a petition and we were invited to please list the site. Please, EPA, add the site to the national priorities list. We heard that from the tribal governments. We heard that from the states of Oregon and Washington. And so we went through our normal process and we did an evaluation. We determined that the site was worthy of being added to the Superfund list. The risk was serious enough that it scores, it deserves to be on the list. And we received more than 1,700 comments from the public. And the vast majority of those were in support of listing. And so it really is because of that public request that we are here. And we are going to be working with the Corps and overseeing the cleanup and ensuring that it is done in a way that's consistent with the Superfund law, and that it also meets the applicable requirements of Washington and Oregon laws.
Thank you for that. This next question, will BPA ratepayers be impacted by cleanup costs?
That would be to me. And for folks that don't know, the Bonneville project costs for cleanup are covered 50% by appropriated funds from Congress and 50% from Bonneville Power Administration ratepayer funding. I believe it's their expense money. Mike, am I correct on that? Yeah. So yes, ratepayers dollars will be used to pay for the cleanup. Whether it will impact the rates that BPA charges the public, I have no idea. But BPA is fully aware of this project and the future costs. And we are working with them right now to sort through that, because there has to be a commitment to pay for this cleanup because of the federal facility agreement. And so that's all being sorted through at this point. There's only so much guarantee, I might add, that we can really give for funding, because Congress decides on the appropriated funds, and we can't tell Congress they have to fund us. That's illegal. So Congress is in charge of the purse strings, and they appropriate the money. We communicate the need, the capability, and why it needs to be done. And then the Congress decides whether they're going to fund us or not. And that's true every year. So that's why I'm saying there's only so much guarantee the Corps and BPA can give to funding the project, but I can tell you the project's been funded every year. There was a slight hiccup in 2020, a misunderstanding. Eventually that funding came through. And so we have been funded every year to continue our investigations and work on this project. And I expect that to continue, but nobody can guarantee that, just so everybody understands. You can't speak for Congress when it comes to appropriating dollars. So.
Thanks, Chris. Next question. Can you talk more about how the Community Advisory Group, or the RAD, will be managed? Will it continue to be more of a corpse-led report out style, with communication only allowing for written questions and concerns? This commenter strongly advises opportunities for more meaningful conversation.
I can speak for what I anticipate, but I think at the CAG meetings, there's going to be open dialogue back and forth, open discussion. There may be a small presentation by our technical team. For example, we have a sampling we want to do in the river, and we'd be putting a work plan together, and we would, just as an example, something we might present to the CAG, tell them what the purpose of the sampling is, where the sampling is going to take place, what we're going to collect, and what data. And then we would open the floor, I would think, for discussion about how we're approaching that, and take under consideration any comments we got back from those in participating in that meeting. So that's how I see this going forward, that yes, we would have dialogue. It wouldn't be you can only write your question down and submit it to the co-chairs. That's way too formal. I don't see the CAG as being as structured. Public meetings are a little different. They have to be structured just because they're usually larger, but the CAG meetings are more of a working group meeting with back and forth dialogue, very dynamic. If I'm wrong, let me know, but that's the way I see this unfolding.
Right. Perfect, Chris.
Got a question from online. Why is there no mention of the fact that the states of Oregon and Washington will be co-signatories to the FFA and involved in this work?
I believe we have mentioned that we're working with, it's called a federal facility agreement for a reason, because it's a federal facility. The Corps and EPA are federal agencies negotiating that agreement. But the states, both Oregon DEQ and Washington Department of Ecology, have regulator authority. And so they are considered, under the terms of this FFA, support agencies. And they are at the table during these negotiations as we negotiate the FFA. And this is kind of a confidential negotiation that goes on between federal agencies and state regulators. And once we have a draft piece of federal facility agreement, that then can be presented to the public for comment. And in fact, it has to be, I think, before it actually gets finalized and signed. So there's, again, a rigorous process you follow to get a federal facility agreement negotiated and through the comment period and ultimately signed.
Do you have anything you want to add, or you?
No, I think Chris did a nice job. Definitely Oregon and Washington, both states will be signatories.
Thank you. Can you talk a bit more specifically about how you are engaging with tribal nations other than the CAG?
I can address that. Yes. We have been engaged with the tribes at a level that when they request a consultation, we meet with them at a leader to leader level. That's government to government consultation, where we go out and engage with them and have confidential conversations. These comments are, the tribe's comments are not public record. They are confidential between the federal agency and the tribe. And if the tribe chooses to share that information, that is their prerogative as a sovereign nation. In addition to that, we have staff level communication with the tribes at their request. So it's not just a concurrent thing that goes on with the other consultations with the state or with the other agencies. We have individuals conversations with the tribe. So we also have the level here at these CAG meetings that involve tribal members. They don't necessarily speak for the tribal government, but they do have a stake in that because they are participants and they are users of the fishing facilities, or they fish in the area that's contaminated. So the tribes have that ability to interact at a different level, meaning that they can speak as an individual in these CAG meetings. But at a much higher level, we speak to the tribal government, and that's where the government consultation is conducted.
Thank you, Craig. Okay, so this question is from the Zoom portal. It's also from Bob Salinger. His question is, can the corpse explain how the contamination, quote, went over the side of the island and into the river, end quote. My understanding is that the corpse bulldozed the contamination into the river.
You know, I don't know if we have good documentation of the actual mechanisms of how it went into the river. You know, it's large equipment, so likely there was some machinery involved. I think that probably the more important point is that, you know, this disposal into the river occurred in the 1950s and 1960s, and at that time we didn't have some of the understanding of what the potential environmental impacts could be from the contamination that was part of this equipment and machinery. And so it was in some ways just kind of common accepted practice to do disposal in kind of an uncontrolled or unregulated way. I think as time went on and we learned more just in the scientific community as a whole, you started to see more environmental regulations into the 70s and beyond that. Now, I mean, nobody would ever dream of doing that kind of disposal practices these days. But back then it was just an accepted practice.
So we're at 7:56 in terms of timing. So this might be our last question. But it looks like we might have only one more anyway. So we'll see how long this answer stays. Okay. Is the corpse committed to a collaborative FFA negotiation process with a goal to be finished by March 2023? The Yakima Nation is very concerned about further delays. This site presents incredible risk and emergency to members who consume high quantities of fish caught near the site.
As Helen mentioned earlier, of course, that's our goal is to negotiate the draft FFA. I really am not sure it can be signed by spring, just because it's not signed by the commander of Portland District. It is being signed by someone very high up in Department of Army. And in order for somebody so many levels above our district commander level, it has to go through quite a few reviews and everything before it is actually signed off on. But the commander committed to negotiating with EPA with the goal of getting that draft FFA knocked out by spring, but whether it's actually signed is another story. And I think we're well on our way to doing that. We're working very closely with EPA and working through a lot of the process of developing that FFA. So I think both EPA and the Corps have that same aspiration. And we'll see if it actually comes out, but you know, that's to be determined, I guess. And just my personal opinion, I find it hard to believe that Army would sign off on it by spring of 23, just because we're barely gonna have a draft and we still have to go out for public comment, address those comments and do further negotiations. So that's my perspective. Helen, do you have other comments? I'm sure you do.
Well, I'll just say, I think the negotiations got off to a slower start than we had hoped. And we are not as far along as we'd like to be, and we are focused and working every week to keep things moving forward. And we're not moving the goalpost yet.
Okay. So that is really brings us to the end. I'm gonna let or Chris close, but I would just add that if you had a burning question that you didn't ask this evening, whether it's online or in the room, some of us will be around and can answer questions after, or you can go to that email address and you can submit that question, and hopefully in the near future, we will actually have a frequently asked questions section on the website. So we'll have kind of, some answers to your burning questions as we move forward in the process, and we'll add to it as we go along. So, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thank you all for your support and your participation. Chris, any closing comments?
No, I'd like to thank everybody for your time tonight. I know that's very valuable for everybody, and this took a chunk of time. I appreciate everybody spending your time with us and allowing us to provide the information that is so very important. And I ask you again to tell your neighbor, reach out and let people know about the fish advisory and the risks associated with that. That's so very important to keep people safe. And we really want to make sure people are safe. And at the same time, stay tuned. We'll be providing more information about the CAG. And we'd love to have you participate in the CAG and help us get through the CERCLA process and get to a cleanup. So thank you, everybody.
Thank
Have
you.
a good evening and drive safely. Go
And
home.
for our panel participants in the room, thanks so much. David, Helen, Chris, Dan, appreciate it. Thank you.